This conference will
There it
now
goes.
be recorded.
All right, so we're here ready to start session 2, More Than a Carpenter. And so I'm going to start out with just a brief review since it has been a couple of weeks since we went over the first session. So start out with just some review thoughts. The main point of first session was that Jesus is equal to God. And how do we know that? It's what makes Christianity so different from other uh, religions, and Christ so much different from other religious figures in various religions is that claim. And if you recall, we looked at how that is something that was claimed by contemporaries, those who lived at the same time, were around Jesus at the time that he lived, identified him as being God or Lord. Um, it, Jesus made that confession himself in different ways, and we looked at that throughout Scripture. And then we also identified it as being the crime that led to Jesus' crucifixion, that he was crucified by who he claimed to be, not anything he claimed to do. So that's just a brief review from that first session. Before we get into the discussion of today's, because the same question Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say I am, is still the question that everyone today has to ask that. And frankly, into eternity, that same question will be asked. And so in the book and in the quarterly, it kind of goes into this discussion of that intellectual honesty demands that we recognize Jesus as more than a good man or a good teacher. Um, and I thought there was a couple of quotes that I thought were good from C.S. Lewis. It was page 20 in the quarterly, but he's the one who kind of first made this case of saying, I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying that the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus, and that is that I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. And C.S. Lewis said that this is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. So anyway, that's kind of his position on it. And in the book, he calls this a uh, trilemma, I guess, a logical trilemma, as opposed to a dilemma. A dilemma would be two choices. This is a trilemma of three. And so I've put together this kind of table to represent kind of the three choices that or places that you end up in this decision tree trilemma. And that's you either accept. First, we established Jesus' claim to be God. That's what the first session was all about. And if that is true, then Jesus is Lord. And if his claim is false, then the two possibilities are that Jesus knew that it was false and he claimed it anyway, which would make him a liar, or that Jesus did not know the claim was not true, in which case he would be a lunatic. And so that's kind of the three options. That's the title of this chapter in the book, is Lord, Liar, or Lunatic. And so there's kind of the way it looks at it. And I guess I'll say this because by the time I got to the end of my discussion on Sunday, I felt like maybe some people were confused. I'm not, the purpose of this study is not to try to convince you of who Jesus is. I assume that if you're attending First Baptist Church and uh, interested in adult Sunday school lessons, that you've probably already made a decision about who Jesus is. The main purpose of this study is to equip ourselves, because there's a lot of the world that doesn't accept who Jesus is, that doesn't accept Jesus as Lord. And so this helps us identify where those other arguments might be, and what the, from a logical standpoint, is that a valid claim? And we're not here, we don't believe, and Josh McDowell in the book doesn't believe that anybody needs to be a Christian based on blind faith. He believes that you can employ all your mental faculties in reaching this decision. And so the purpose of this is to spend some time exploring these other options and come up with the logical explanations to agree that those are not probable. Because are they possible options? Yes, but are they probable based on all the data that we know? So that's kind of what, so we're going to talk about these. We're going to talk about the, is Jesus a liar and is he a lunatic options. And I'm not trying to present this as if I think that you all may be confused. I'm presenting this so that when you encounter people, that you understand that there's really only three options and how to respond to those arguments. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to spend some time talking about this. What if Jesus knowingly lied about being God? So you have Jesus, a man born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, who at the age of 30 got this wild idea to attempt to convince people that he was God. Does that make sense? Is that a likely direction that somebody could have pulled off? The first question is, why would you try to do that in Israel, in a Jewish nation with a population that strictly adhered to the concept of one God? He would have been if it was somebody trying to pull off a hoax, been much better off packing a bag, heading to Greece or somewhere where there were a host of gods, and you could show up and make your claim, and they say, which one are you? Because there was much more willingness to accept additional gods as opposed to going to a monotheistic society like the nation of Israel and the people of Israel were. So that's the first question. Does that make sense? Why would he try to pull this off among those people? And what would it say about his own disciples and followers if Jesus was just making this up intentionally? What would it say about those who were his followers, those who gave up everything to follow him for the next 3 years plus of their lives? Have any thoughts on what would you think of the disciples?
They'd have to be awfully brave to take that stand with him.
Right. So if they were in on it, then they were just as, you would have to put them in the same category. They would have to be either lunatics themselves or liars themselves, right? Because they would either have to be incredibly gullible or they would have to be in on the lie, right?
And daring to, like you said, to be going into a monotheistic,
right. Right, because they would probably be, they would be putting their whole family and everything at risk for this, which again it's just from a probable, is that probable that they would do that? It doesn't seem so to me. Even people like the Apostle Paul, why would he shift? I mean, he didn't even have a personal relationship with Jesus while he was alive to then give up everything to follow it. Anyway, that, I think those are, it's again, is it possible? I suppose, but not very probable. And why would Jesus have pressed toward activities that led to his crucifixion? In the first session, we talked about, that final climactic point where being questioned by the high priest, Jesus finally declared, he said, "Are you the Messiah?" And he said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand and coming on the clouds," and stuff that clearly made the connection. He wouldn't have had to done that. Um, if it was just a lie, he could have saved his skin. Now, maybe you could say, well, maybe he had read the prophecies enough to know that ultimately this had to be done. But then you get into, and how could he orchestrate all those? How could one person trying to pull this off orchestrate all the prophecy fulfillments that came to be? Again, probabilities are not on that side. And there were times in Jesus' ministry where he told people, "Don't tell people who I am." He was trying to prevent people from sharing who he was, so that it was up to God to determine when his ministry was over, rather than trying to hasten it along. And that doesn't seem to coincide with somebody who was trying to pull off a extraordinary lie either. Because you would think if somebody was trying to pull off a fast one on somebody, as soon as they had somebody who was willing to buy it, you'd think that they would want them to spread that word. So can you think of any other actions or words that would contradict the assumption that Jesus was lying? Anything that you think of is like, well, that would not make sense if he was just intentionally telling a lie about who he was. We talked about that still doesn't explain miracles. I mean, maybe he can be a great storyteller and make up this great tale, but that still doesn't explain miracles. So, lie or no lie, miracles seem to happen based upon the historical record. Anything else you can think of that would just wouldn't make sense if Jesus was lying?
Like when he was driving out evil spirits, and the evil spirits knew who he was and would
Right.
say, "Jesus, Son of God, leave me alone."
Right.
And he's like, "Hush,
Right.
don't say anything."
Right. Yeah. So testimony coming from kind of unlikely places, even he was keeping that from getting widely spread too. So the other thing that the book talked about was, if Jesus was trying to pull off this as a lie, could somebody be consistently good and hold this one falsehood, maybe 99.9% good, but they just had this one area? Do you know anybody who's able to do that, who's just the greatest person in the world, but they just got this one slight fault? It doesn't show up any other time. It's just this one little thing that they keep well hidden over here in this little box. We had a little bit of discussion on the unfortunate revelations about Ravi Zacharias, who's an apologetic teacher who has great books, has great sermons, and since his death, it's been revealed that he had some very inappropriate things going on in his life with extramarital affairs, as well as almost bringing people over to the U.S. so that he could have them work for him. Anyway, it was just very odd, and it does kind of, in this case of could somebody pull this off, it almost feels like Ravi Zacharias to some extent did. So that's probably a example of someone who has been inconsistent, yet for the most part came across as very solid in their beliefs. So anyway, it does bring into doubt, because most of the time when we think of somebody who's trying to pull off that big of a lie, we think, well, it's going to show up elsewhere. You can't be all that good and still have this big lie as kind of the background of your life. So any other thoughts on that? Again, I'm not trying to, it's not that I believe anybody among us believes that Jesus was lying, but it is good to kind of explore that kind of branch of options to see, again, is it probable? Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I don't think so. So now we'll look at the next argument, and that was he unknowingly lying. So he just had, as we talked about on Sunday, some delusion of grandeur. He thought he was a whole lot more than he ever really was, and got to the point where he believed it so much that he was telling people about it. He really wasn't, but that's what he believed. And if you look at John 14, we read this together, and in here it's the passage where he says, let not your hearts be troubled, believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go there to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am you may be also. And later this is where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you know the Father also. Anyway, those are some of the statements that he made. And if Jesus was not God, how big of a problem would you have with some of those words? Anything about that? If somebody on the street came up to you and shared those same things, what would you think of them?
I think they were crazy.
Yeah, or pretty full of themselves. Hey, if you know me, you pretty much know what God is. It's like, wow. So what would we do with somebody like that? So might, what would we might to ourselves say, that person is cray cray, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what else? I mean, if somebody like that continued to be out there as a society, how do people react to someone like that?
Well, some will buy into it. I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We talked about, some of the different occults, like Jim Jones, like
Mm-hmm.
David Koresh, and they had a group of followers that were completely convinced, right?
John Smith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
So it does happen,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes people like that become a menace or a danger to society, and we have, a scenario of maybe they need to be put into a padded room somewhere, if because if somebody like that thinks they could endanger themselves, right? I mean, they could endanger themselves, they can endanger others. Uh, you know, the reason why people like David Koresh and others basically bring about a very violent end is because they really don't want to survive. If they can't be that, they don't want to hang around, right? So they go out with a
Glory.
big, yeah, flame of glory, I guess. Um, so is there anything about Jesus' conduct, the record of his conduct, or the record of his conduct of his followers, that would indicate to you that they were mentally unstable? that they had some delusion of grandeur, and they really just weren't all that. They were just full of themselves and on some type of trip about it. Is there anything else about the conduct that would make you think that? Yeah,
Well,
I don't. Go ahead.
I was just going to say James and John arguing over who would get to sit,
Right. Yeah.
right. But other than
Right.
that,
Yeah. In the quarterly on page 25 and the book on page 35, it shares a psychiatrist perspective that everything that psychological principles are built on are pretty much found within Matthew chapter 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. So not directly, but a lot of the same thing that modern psychology emphasizes is all right there. And the point was that hard to think that you've got a lunatic sharing in the most extensive sermon given, providing all these sound psychological principles if they're not sound psychologically themselves, right? And let's look at John 13:3. In John 13:3, this is all part of the John 14, all this section of John is when Jesus has his disciples in the upper room. And as he's leading up to the Last Supper, it says that Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. And this is when he washed the disciples' feet. But it's interesting the way that is stated, and it kind of helps understand why, if Jesus knew these things, that he was from God and that all things were in his hands, then it helps understand why he could maintain an emotional and spiritual balance as he made these statements. That's really, to me, the only way you could, right? Because otherwise, whether you're making, writing checks that your bank can't cash, or however you might want to say it, somebody in that position is likely not going to seem very balanced across their life. But the one exception would be Jesus, because according to this, he knew that God placed everything in his hands. And so, anyway, that's kind of interesting that when you read it that perspective, that gave Jesus the confidence, the truth, and also the balance to approach the things the way he did. So, could Jesus have been so sound in his life and also been a lunatic, or this you know person who has a real delusion of his own grandeur? Could he have lived a sound life? Just kind of like we said before about lying. Could he have been unstable and also lived this consistent, well-balanced life?
I don't.
Yeah, I think this one is really hard to believe that somebody could be that off their rocker and still pull it off from start to finish consistently. But again, that gets into, is it possible? Is it probable? Possible, yes. Probable, I don't think so.
Not real possible.
So there's one more, and the book didn't present it this way, but as I was doing some separate research, I kind of looked at it because they said, well, what if what if it wasn't really Jesus who made these claims? Because what if it was people, or even centuries later who kind of thrust all this upon him. And so Jesus was just this good guy. And then over decades, over centuries, all this other stuff just got imposed upon him. And I mean, that would be more of a legend, that it grew into something a whole lot more than it actually was in real terms. So that kind of becomes the next L. But so this assumes that he lived, taught, died a martyr, but all the claims about him being equal to God would have come later, not by Jesus himself. And so this, I think, to explore this, we do have to kind of dig into a little bit about the history of the New Testament. And the Council of Nicaea, have you ever heard of the Council of Nicaea? So the Council of Nicaea, and Nicaea is a place, I don't know if I remember if it's in Italy or Asia Minor or where it's at, but in 325 AD, Constantine, who was the Roman Empire, Constantine was the first Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. And it was more of a process for him. And one of his steps in his process, he called all the bishops of the early church to come to this council in Nicaea. And they show up in 325 AD. There's about 300 of them, which that's a pretty big number for the early church. And some of the research that I looked at said that it was bishops from everywhere from modern day Great Britain to North Africa to Asia Minor. They all, from all these different walks of life and congregations, showed up to have this, and it was like a big committee meeting. And the purpose of it was to lock in on what they believed about Jesus and lock in on what scriptures, what they were going to be believed to be scriptures, or as the term would be, what scriptures would become canonized in our New Testament today. And so it started with this Council of Nicaea in 325. And so you can say, okay, well, 325, if Jesus died around 33 AD or whatever, that's 300 years. And so maybe you've heard or seen the book by Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code. And this is what the suggestion is in that book, is that it was Constantine, when he called these guys together, that's when they created this legend. That's when they thrust all these ideas of Jesus claiming to be God. It really wasn't this man Jesus himself. It was 300 years later, and now all of a sudden it's a major religion. That's their theory. But we're going to go into some of the next week's study will be on, is the Bible reliable? And we'll go more into detail. But let's talk, we'll hit this one just to wrap up our discussion. So after roughly 300 years, is it reasonable to assume that enthusiastic followers of Jesus ended up exaggerating who he was and making him out to be more than he actually was? Is it possible? Yes. But again, is it probable? One of the things that to me make it improbable, well, there's a few things. One is the timing of the gospel accounts. And we'll again go into this more next week, but most of the gospels were written between roughly 50 AD and 80 AD. So that would still be within the lifetimes of those who heard it firsthand, certainly within an easy reach generation. And at that time, oral history was much more reliable than we would consider it today. Goodness, today you can't believe what the media reports about something that happened last week. But at this time, people were much better at keeping a verbal history, an accurate verbal history. And the fact that the gospel accounts were written within that generation is very, very solid evidence. It wasn't 300 years later. And then in the book, it also provides some quotes from people in the first, I guess what would be second century, 100s AD. Let me look at that. And if you want to turn there, you can. But quotes a couple of early church leaders, Ignatius of Antioch, who said God incarnate, God himself appeared in the form of a man. So this guy, AD 110, he wasn't making it up. That's what he believed, 110. So 200 years before the Council of Nicaea, here's a guy who was already saying that Jesus was God himself. Justin the Martyr, say again, about the same time, that Jesus being the first begotten Word of God is even God. And Irenicus, the Father is God, the Son is God, for who is born of God is God. So anyway, that just gives evidence that there wasn't this, well, Jesus lived, and then 300 years later, they thrust all this upon him. The Gospels that were written in the, say, 30 years after they were saying it, these guys were saying it 80 years later. So you've gone from 30, verify at 80. And then he also points to what somebody who's not even a believer said. And this is a Roman governor, Pliny the Younger, AD 112, talking about persecuted Christians and saying that they met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god. And so there again, that's not even a believer reporting on what Christians were doing and saying that they were basically accrediting deity to Christ. So I think that shows it wasn't a big 300-year gap and then this legend of Christ materialized at Nicaea. It was there 30 AD, 60 AD, 100 AD, and yes, it was still there 100 or 325 AD also.
Well, Simeon recognized him when he was taken to the temple
Right,
for being, and wasn't it
right,
Hannah? They
right,
both recognized him for who he was,
right,
and
right.
he was
But
an
we
infant.
have that account in the Gospels, and so
Uh-huh.
again, that's
Okay.
tied to when the Gospels were written, and the fact that those Gospels were written helps confirm. There would have been, at the time that the Gospels were written, there would have been people who not only knew who Jesus were, there might have been people who remembered, oh, you remember old Anna at the church? Yeah, I mean, there were still people around when the Gospels were written, and if it was false, there would have been plenty of people still around who could have said so. So I do think that is another, again, as we're thinking about not this of whether we believe it, but what do others believe and how we can be prepared to respond to their positions. And then, so I've basically added this other little column over here that maybe Jesus never claimed to be, and that it was attributed to him much later. So I do think that this certainly can account for all the people that you come across. It comes back to that same question Jesus said, who do you say that I am? And I mean, if it's not Lord, then they're going to fall into one of these three camps. And I think it's important that we, as practicing Christians now in the 21st century, know that we have not just faith, but we have logic on our side and we have historical facts on our side to put these out and to hold to our position that Jesus' claim is true and that he is Lord. So that's kind of where I think I'm going to wrap up today. Do you have any thoughts, comments on that?
Well, how could that religion have stood up for that many years? I mean, these
Right,
cults come and go.
right. And that's a good point. And we're going to in the next week's session on Is the Bible Reliable? We'll get into some of that I've already started studying obviously in preparation, but it says that if anything, over time, history and archaeology has done nothing but validate more
Mhm.
things in the Bible than the opposite. A lot of people want to say, oh, well, science is proving that it's not correct, and that's not true. I mean, all science is doing is proving that it is reliable, and the fact that, like you said, that it has maintained that consistency over the years is another strong testament.
And
Yep.
there's so many authors of the Old Testament that their sayings is carried over to the New Testament.
Right, right, and nobody seems to have a problem with the Old Testament. Any other thoughts?
No.
Well, thank you for joining, and next week it'll be session 3 in the quarterly, or if you're reading the book, you got 3 chapters to read, 4, 5, and 6. I think a lot of the quarterly focuses on chapter 6, but 4 and 5 I'll probably pull from that as well, because it's all good information. Is again just trying to provide additional facts to back up what we believe about the Bible and its reliability. So I'm going to end it there. Thanks for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, Dan.